Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Secret Sunday session today. Today, I'm joined by Brad Dryburgh, and I'm really excited to have him on today because he's going to be sharing a lot about his story and his mission and what he's doing in this space. We're also going to be talking a bit about mental health and how we can actually create change in this space, because at the moment, there's a lot of conversations that are happening, which is great, something that I think we haven't really had for a while, but it will be amazing to actually hear and see if we can find ways to actually implement positive mental health practices into our everyday. So no further ado, welcome, Brad. Thank you so much for joining us.
My absolute pleasure. It's good to be here.
Now, firstly, I think for a lot of us, we come on here and everyone that jumps on a podcast, you sort of see a new name and people do their little bit of research, but it's always great to hear your story and explain a little bit about who you are. So I kind of want to put that to you in a bit of a sum up. And if you could just explain to everyone who you are and what it is that you do with yourself.
Well, I guess the basics would be 27-year-old guy from Wollongong here in Australia. I describe myself as a storyteller. Like that's the thing I'm really passionate about, story and the way that story connects us as human beings and the way that we can use story to do very similar to what you've done with, these podcasts and your mission in life and, to connect story to a purpose to help people. And it's a big part of what I do and the way that I identify myself. I'm pretty much just a regular cat. Like I love many of the things that most Aussies do, being out in the sun, a good coffee. I've got an amazing partner, great friends. I'm quite active and I guess I'm just a go-getter. Like I'm a life liver and I just love getting up in the morning, charging out of bed and really doing something with my day and fueling that adventure. That is life.
I love that. That is, I think, one of the best sum ups I've heard on this podcast of just a perfect way to, I don't want to use the word perfect, but it is a beautiful way for you to enjoy your life and what serves your purpose. Now, we did mention there a little bit about missions, and I know you've got your own mission. What is that? And can you explain to people a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I was born with cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic illness. I guess it's actually the most common genetic illness in Australia, but it's still classified as a rare disease. So around 4,000 Aussies, maybe just a little under that, live with cystic fibrosis. A lot of people may know what CF is, especially in the last year, we had Lyndall on Married at First Sight. So I guess Australia got a deeper insight into what cystic fibrosis is and how it affects people who live with it. But it's very different for everyone who suffers from CF. And I hate to use the word suffer. I know a lot of people do struggle with it. I've always seen it as just a part of who I am. But essentially, cystic fibrosis is it's a gene in the body that is defective. It doesn't do its job. And that gene, without getting too scientific, essentially is supposed to supply the chloride channel with salt and water that allows that to move to the cells in the body, which would keep mucus moving thinly and freely throughout the organs of the body. Where you don't have that gene working effectively, mucus tends to sit thicker and stickier on the organs, which impairs the function of the organ and also scars the organ where it sits there for too long. Now, when you think of mucus, you often think of the respiratory system, which is most commonly the case. So people with cystic fibrosis tend to struggle with lung disease or difficulty breathing and accessing all of the air and capacity of their lungs. But it also commonly affects people's digestive systems within the CF space. And, for me, that looks like pancreatic deficiency. So I take tablets every time I eat food to digest that nutrition. But also it affects things like, diabetes and the blood sugar levels, because that pancreas isn't producing enough insulin to handle what the body's taking in through carbohydrates. But also for me, I've got liver disease. So it affects an array of things. And so I guess from a very early age, I knew that life was going to be somewhat different for me. And I had things that were going to become a part of the challenges and the obstacles that lie ahead. And essentially for me, without diving too much into the story now, because I'm sure we'll, develop it throughout the course of the pod, but essentially it's provided me with an opportunity to share my story in a way that is uplifting and inspiring for others, or at least I'd like to think so. And that's fueled me to basically come together on this question of, well, what is purpose? And for me, purpose is two things. It's asking myself, what am I passionate about, or what are my gifts in life? And then how can I use those things to serve the greater good? And so I landed on the fact that I love storytelling and the fact that I've been given this really, I guess, in somewhat way, unique challenge in cystic fibrosis, and to be able to use that to uplift and inspire hope in others has become, my mission in life. And so through that, I've created the podcast, A Lot to Talk About, which is, quickly approaching on 200 episodes, I believe. We're coming up to that mark, that milestone very soon. And, I get on stage, I speak, I'm a keynote speaker, and, find myself sort of dabbling in all areas of storytelling to communicate these messages and, hopefully put smiles on the faces of people who are struggling or wading through some tougher times in life, whether that be something like cystic fibrosis or, they're in the midst of a battle against mental health illness or issues. And, I just really want to uplift people and allow them to see the power that's within inside of them. And, often that's understanding where you're at and then making a decision to move forward from there. And so in a nutshell, that's my mission and that's what I love.
Wow, congratulations on that journey and finding that mission and pursuing it, because that's phenomenal to really deal with such challenges in your life, be able to turn that around and go, no, I have an opportunity here to really create change in not only my life, but other people's lives. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And then, I want to take you back to those first moments when you did find out that you had cystic fibrosis. How old were you, and do you remember those moments and what was going through your head at the time?
Well, I guess there's two answers to that question. The first would be, cystic fibrosis being something that I was born with was something that I unconsciously dealt with for a number of years. I remember my parents telling me a lot of stories around the first few years of my life with CF. And, they were like my two parents. I love them dearly, Darren and Diane. They're two of the most incredible people ever. They're angels on earth. And I was their first child, and they were as planned as you could be to bring a child into the world. Like, they had worked extra jobs, saved all the money, built the dream family home, and set up an environment in which they knew that with a planned approach, they could bring their first child into the world. And I would have all the love, care, attention, and opportunity that any child could ever desire. And so as they started to enact on that plan, I was born on the 12th of April, 1996. And, they felt as though the plan was moving smoothly. And, Mike Tyson, the heavyweight boxer, has a great quote that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And 3 weeks after my birth, my parents received just the ultimate uppercut from life, where I was diagnosed just through routine heel prick testing that I had cystic fibrosis. And so hearing those words at the time, my parents could tell via the tone in the doctor's voice that this was a challenge, but they didn't really have an understanding or knowledge of what cystic fibrosis was. Now, back in 1996, CF was often referred to as the childhood's disease because people didn't make it out of their childhood years or their teenage years. It was just something that they didn't have the medication to counteract the degenerative style of disease that CF was. They also probably didn't have the understanding around what was really happening in the body at this point in time, but they were starting to develop that. And so really the first bunch of information and education that my parents took on was that there's a long and difficult road ahead, and you need to be ready to fight for your child's life, every day. And so after diving into the research, the education, my parents started to equip themselves with, the tools that they needed to handle life as CF parents. And, it's crazy to look back, because I look forward to having children in the next couple of years. And, as you start to think about what a life with children will look like, that it takes a lot of selflessness. It takes a lot of extra time and extra care and extra attention, and it's so relentless. But to think that my parents spent hours a day doing hands-on physio on their little baby boy, having to learn how to do it so that they didn't break my ribs and they could clear my chest of any mucus. And every time I was breastfed, I had to take little beads that were mashed up in puree so that I could digest the nutrition, from that breast milk. And so there was so much extra to it, and they were just so vigilant and done everything they could to make sure I had a healthy foundation. But I think it was a couple of months in, probably 6 months in, 5 months into my life, they went to see my first cystic fibrosis specialist, the guy who's supposed to sit across the table and arm them with all the information they need, give them a plan to move forward, make them feel a little bit more certain about what the future looks like. And this doctor blankly in the first couple minutes of meeting them, sits across the table from them, looks them in the eyes and says that your son would be better off with a terminal illness that would kill him or he'd get over, because this will ruin his life. And, I think to that moment, and I couldn't blame my parents had their reaction been to absorb that information and believe it to be fact. But what my parents did next has defined the rest of my life, where they stood up in front of that doctor, looked him back in the eyes and said, "You'll never see us or our son again," and walked out of that room. And they had a firm belief that my life wasn't going to be defined by cystic fibrosis, that it wasn't going to limit me, that my future, my trajectory was going to be bold, it was going to be excellent. And so what they taught me in that moment, when I was completely unconscious of the lesson to be learned there, but have now the beauty of hindsight to look back, is that what you believe is what you become. And my parents believed that I was destined to do great things, that a healthy life was ahead of me. And so that for me meant that when I first was conscious that there's some things that make me different. I've got this thing called CF that means I'm at the doctor's every 8 weeks going through tests and checks. I have to take 30 tablets a day as a young man. I have to do all these things to keep my health in check. But my parents have got smiles on their faces. My little sister is sitting up at the breakfast table next to me in the morning having chewy strawberry flavored vitamins because she wants to take tablets like her older brother. So whilst I've got this thing that makes me different, it's actually a badge of honor because I'm celebrated for it. And so with that, my first conscious understanding of this condition that I had and was going to live with for the rest of my life was something that I knew would challenge me, but rather I should be proud of it because I was able to overcome those challenges. I had undeniable proof of that. And so for me, the first conscious understanding of CF was something to be celebrated because it was just what made me me. So that's the way that I describe it. And it's weird to think back because I don't think there's any one moment I can call on in which I was like, oh, I have this thing and it's cystic fibrosis. Like it just was a thing that I was consciously aware of and able to navigate life with it.
How amazing are your parents to build such solid foundations and beautiful foundations for you at such a young age, going through, as you said, something so challenging that often people look at as a negative experience. And just to hear you speak about that with passion and with love and even compassion for yourself, that is just phenomenal, because I know I've spoken to people that, and even myself, when I've gone through something, you always take a negative turn on it. You play almost the victim card, and I hate using that word, but everything changes in terms of your mentality around it because it's an illness or it's a challenge and it's this negative connotation. And I think that's sometimes how we do get stuck, because we're so stuck in the dialogue of when we're dealt with something, how it's a negative experience, and instead of turning it into something that this is part of me and this is my story and I can overcome this.
I couldn't agree with you more. One of my mates says this quote all the time. He says, "It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility." And for me, that sums it up perfectly, because, there's things about ourselves that we can't change. Like I can't change the fact that I was born with cystic fibrosis, but much like a game of poker, you can't control the hand that you're dealt, but you have a choice. You either throw your cards in, call it quits and walk away from the table, or you go, "No, I'm going to be a stubborn bastard. I'm going to put my feet down. I'm going to get set at this table. I'm going to order a few drinks. I'm going to play this hand out until there ain't any chips left." And for me, that has been the story of my life. It's, my hand looked pretty sweet at the time. Like I was, a young man with CF, but I had these incredible parents who were incredibly positive and went above and beyond to make sure that the foundations of my health, like, mentally and spiritually, they were incredibly positive, but they also done all the physical work that kept my physical health intact. And so really for the first 18 years of my life, despite, having a cystic fibrosis diagnosis, a liver disease diagnosis at the age of 9, which only 10% of people with CF are diagnosed with. So we knew we weren't dealt the best hand there, but it's like, this is a hand we're dealt, let's deal with it. Diabetes at 13, esophageal varices issues at 16. I had all of these really heavy diagnoses on my medical records. But for me, it was just kind of like words. It was like, these are just words on a certificate. They're not affecting my life in the way in which they were supposed to, or the way in which certain doctors believe they certainly would have. And so for me, it was a real badge of honor. But it wasn't until really 18 that I started to have challenges with my health. And I think for me, then it went from being quite a seamless battle to one that I was super conscious of, and one that I was like, all right, now I'm in it. I'm in the thick of it. CF, I understand CF in a different way now. It's presenting more challenges than it ever has. There's more obstacles ahead of me. But I believe the foundation of mental resilience that I built in the first 18 years of my life was exactly what I needed to handle the challenges that were ahead.
So talk me through that then, because obviously your parents played such an important role during your cystic fibrosis at such a young age. But then there would have been a point where you would have then had to take on that responsibility of taking care of yourself. How was that, and how did you get through that?
Yeah, it's funny. I always look back and my parents say that like I was always extremely independent. So my parents laugh about me being 4 years old, us being down the beach and, under a watchful eye, me approaching every group of strangers with a football or a cricket bat and like inviting myself into their game and having an adult conversation. I was always an independent person who knew the path I wanted to take in life and knew how to look after myself. But I think as parents who have dedicated so much of their life and their purpose to bringing their children up. And my sister's received all this same love and dedication from my parents too. She doesn't have CF, but she's an amazing person and is really close with them too and close with me. I think for them, it was hard to let go of that. But I think they had all the faith in the world that I could take the bull by the horns and keep charging forward. But at 18, I guess the challenge for me was, I had liver disease, so I was never going to drink. I took 50 tablets a day at this point. So I was never interested in recreational drugs or taking extra pills that could potentially do me harm. So I wasn't going to take or make maybe some of the same mistakes that other kids my age would. But for me, it was starting to like get a little bit complacent about the fact that, well, I've been really good up until now, so maybe I can take my foot off the pedal. Maybe I don't have to do all the things that mum and dad made sure I did for the first 18 years, like the extra lung physio or the nebulizers. And, I started to rest on my laurels a little bit. Maybe you could almost call it cheat the system. And so I got to 18 and started to focus really professionally on what I wanted to do in a work sense and the career that I wanted to have. And that took a few different forms and shapes. And I made a few different decisions on, being in this industry and then that industry. But I think in the process, I set my sights so much on making money that I found I started to get complacent with my health. And so for me, it was like the first time that I really thought, this is that other side of CF was, I was 18 at the time and I've been planning to go in for a routine surgery on my esophageal varices, which essentially, I guess for people to understand it and understand what I mean here is that the liver being under so much pressure, being scarred, being a little bit larger than it should have been, meant that it was really hard for just the normal blood to pass through my liver as it would in any other person's body. And so blood would take alternate routes to escape the liver. So it didn't get stuck, and often it would find its way up into the base of the esophagus, which is kind of just like at the bottom of the sternum there. And it would fill up in these varices or these veins that line the esophagus. And where those veins or varices would get too thick and fill up with too much blood, they could potentially burst and bleed internally, which is potentially fatal. So they'd go down into my esophagus with a camera and with this little vacuum. And where they were too thick, they'd suck them into the vacuum, which blows it up like a balloon, tie a little elastic band around it, and essentially it constricts the blood flow. And then that vein dies and falls off. And so I started having these procedures from around the age of 16. They're just day surgeries where you spend like the next week being pretty careful of, only drinking liquids, and you got to really watch what you consume and look after yourself. But I had a few of these and I knew that these were really important for keeping me well and, essentially keeping me alive. And so I was ready to go in for my third one of these procedures. And the week leading up to it, I got really sick. I got very sick with fevers and I was hot and I was cold. And then I started towards the end of that week to form a cough. And it come to the day of the surgery, the Friday, and mum and dad, as they always would really into the last 2 years, would drive to every appointment with me just to be there for support. Not that I felt like I needed it those years, but I just think it was nice just to know that it was time we all got together and, just that we always had this real support system around me and my health. And so we were driving up, and I remember on the way, I just could not stop coughing. And I knew I was really sick. And I started to feel as though for the first time in 18 years, like mucus was building up in my lungs. And so we got to the hospital, and as you would prior to any surgery, you go through like a pre-surgery check. And the nurse takes your blood pressure, your temperature, does all the essential and vital tests to determine that you're well enough to go into surgery. And she reported back a blood pressure of 180 over 100, temperature over 39. And she was like, mate, you cannot go into surgery today. You need to be in hospital. You're incredibly ill. And so I was sent home disappointed because I knew how important this surgery was, but also determined to get back to a place of good health. And also a little bit confused with what's going on inside my body because I've never felt this before. You know, like anyone, I'd had colds and flus and little ups and downs, but I felt really sick. And so as I got home, you know, we're waiting for a call to say that there was a hospital bed available for me to spend a couple of weeks to get better. And I was just sitting on the lounge the next day with my dad, and my coughing had become worse. And one particularly sharp cough led to a particularly strong taste in my mouth. That was a taste of blood. And I remember the first time I tasted that in my mouth. You know, everyone's bit the side of their cheek or, you know, brushed their teeth too hard, and you can taste a little bit of blood come from your gums. But this was the taste of not just a little bit, but a lot. And I remember racing to the laundry sink and then just repeatedly coughing up fresh blood. So much blood that, you know, as I'm spitting out onto the silver sink, it's staining it red, and just fear and anxiety starts to wash over my body because up until this point in time, I've been told by every doctor I ever had that if you ever cough up fresh blood, it's a matter of life or death. You get to the hospital immediately. Something is bleeding inside of you and it's not good. So I remember calling out to my dad at the top of my lungs, him running into the laundry and seeing the blood in the sink. And then within a matter of a minute, we're in the car driving towards the emergency room, just about a 10-minute drive from where we lived. I just remember sitting in the car and had an empty ice cream container in my lap to cough the blood into. And I remember looking up at dad and thinking, far out, is he going to watch me die in the car? Is he going to get me there quick enough? Is he going to have to live with the guilt if he doesn't? Is he going to have to carry me over his shoulder into the emergency room and hope that someone's skilled enough to save my life, or that, you know, there's enough time up their sleeve to do that? And as I'm looking at him thinking these thoughts, sort of comes over my mind that my mum and my sister aren't in the car. They're not with us. They don't know what's going on. And thankfully, they worked at the same place at the time. And I just remember calling their office, and my sister answered the phone and just saying, I don't know what's happening, but I'm coughing up a lot of blood and we're on our way to emergency. Can you and mum meet us there ASAP? Tell mum I love her and I love you so much. And just remembering that's like the hardest call I've ever had to make in my life, because I couldn't help but feel as though once I hung up, maybe I would never see them or talk to them again. And it almost feels as though the rest of the drive, time just stood still. I can't remember saying anything else. I can't remember what happened next, but I remember walking into emergency and just all of a sudden my body stabilized and I stopped coughing and no more blood was coming up. And after a bunch of investigation and testing, they determined that the blood was coming from my lungs and that I had a really bad case of pneumonia. And I spent the next like 3 to 5 weeks in hospital, and I lost a lot of weight. Like I lost 9 kilos, and I found myself in a place and space in which I was like in the fight. My lung x-rays had always been clear, and now they were full of scars and full of issues in my lungs. And I remember thinking, far out, this CF thing has been up until this point just kind of a whisper in the wind. Like I knew I had it. I took 50 tablets a day. I did all these things to look after it and maintain it, but it's never challenged me like this. And almost overnight, I've gone from a place of this will never touch me, this will never faze me or challenge me, to my lungs are permanently scarred forever. Things have changed. And I remember that was the first time that I consciously, as an adult, had to take ownership of the fact that maybe I have been a little bit complacent here. And yes, maybe not all of this is my fault, because after all, I do have a genetic inherited disease, but it is most certainly my responsibility. And if I want to live a healthy life, a long life, it's time that I take this really seriously. And so that for me was the first time that I took ownership, I would say, of my CF.
Wow. And to get to such, I guess, dire straits in order to experience that, that would have been so hard. I mean, were you scared at all in that moment?
I was terrified in the moment. And, I say all the time that, whether you call it a life, you call it like a near, I wouldn't call it a near death experience, but I'd call it a life realization. And, at the time I thought it was a near death experience because I'd been told to act in that way, if you were ever coughing up blood. But a life realization for me, because it's the first time in my life that I contemplated the fact that I'm actually mortal,
Mm.
like the fact that I'm not immortal, the fact that, I don't have 9 lives. I'm here. This is my one life. And there's a Confucius quote that sums it up beautifully, that every man lives 2 lives. The second begins when he realizes he has just one.
Mm.
And for me, it was that realization that, okay, this is real. I live
Mm.
with this thing, and I have to learn to not only live with it on my medical record, but to live with it presently every day in the way that it challenges me now. And
Mm.
so that fear over the course of the next couple of weeks in hospital slowly become less challenging, and rather turned into motivation, turned into drive of, well, I need to get out of here and really do something about this. And I guess for me, it's funny because I don't know that many other people would describe it this way, but I've always had this really interesting relationship with hospital stays in which most people dread it. And don't get me wrong, like I'd prefer to be at home in my own bed around my own people with the freedom to live life the way that I want to. But there's always been incredible lessons for me that have come from a hospital stay. I think it's appreciation,
Mm.
gratitude. It's definitely an eye-opening experience that gives you a lot of perspective. And for me, spending a couple of weeks in a hospital bed and looking around at, you know, how how health can affect people, how health shouldn't be taken for granted,
Mm.
how lucky I am when I am at home and are living the life that I want to lead. It definitely is one of those things that gives me a real kick up the arse.
Mm.
And so I left there with more determination than ever and a little better understanding of who I am as a human being.
Mm. I mean, and you look at yourself now, and you do feel like, I feel like even through a screen, that you've got so much accountability for your story and for your cystic fibrosis. But I mean, you talk about this positivity and this new outlook and focus on your life, knowing that you are still living with this and still have struggles with this. But I mean, it's hard to see that you could still have a bad day today. But do you still find that you do struggle with this even in your own life today and have those bad days?
I would say less now. And don't get me wrong, there's still days where it is challenging. Like just last Saturday night, there was a little bit of blood that I coughed up after not being too well over the
Mm.
course of that week. Like I had a bit of a flu. But I would say that, the last few years have been particularly interesting and very forming for me. It was really after that point in time at 18 that every year I found that I started to have like a little health challenge. And, it was often just like an infection that would come into the lungs, and I'd spend a week or two in hospital and have to get over that and get myself back to a place of health. But it really wasn't until I was about 23 that I'd been so focused on making money in my career, and I felt so out of touch with who I was and my health that I had a real scare where I got a call to say that I'd developed an infection in my lungs called Burkholderia capacia, which sounds very scientific, but basically in layman's terms, it means that, um, you know, basically it's time to really get serious about your CF, because this infection can be fatal. It's in some best cases just permanently damages the cells within the lungs, which would mean you could never have a lung transplant if you needed it. And that wasn't even a thought or consideration for me. But when you're told that a safety net is being ripped from underneath you, you don't feel as certain about the future. And I remember going in a hospital that time, and they were going to put me on like 2 to 3 weeks of very intense 24/7 antibiotic treatment to try and get rid of this before it set its foundations in my lungs. I remember for me, that was a real pivotal moment. It was a life-changing experience because it got to a point where I was like, something needs to change. Like I had that very real life realization at the age of 18. Here we are 5 years later, and I've just been on the same cycle of leave hospital, get really motivated about getting myself back on track for a month. And then all of a sudden I get a little bit healthy again. I get complacent, and 11 months later, we're back in the same spot. And so, but it was particularly one thing that changed the trajectory of everything for me. It was an older gentleman named Ernie. So I found myself in hospital for this 2-week stay. And as always, my mum and dad come up with me the first day. They, like crazy people, spray the room down with every bit of alcohol, swab and swipe and, wipe that they can to make sure that the room is 100% clean and, infection free. And they always put me in a solo room at the hospital because for someone with CF, when you've got a really bad infection in your lungs, your immune system is heavily damaged, so that, you can pick up something else in hospital pretty quickly that could be, potentially fatal when you're at that point. And so they put me in this solo room. And I remember this one particular morning, I think it was the second morning I was there, my mum had come up to see me before work. And, we walked out into the hallway to go down to the kitchen to make a coffee and a tea. And we bumped into an older gentleman. He was staying in the room next to mine. His name was Ernie. And my mum had sold him a car before. And I remember we were just talking to Ernie. Mum introduced me. And as I looked into his room, I could see 3 older guys in there who were all pretty sick. You could just feel the energy of the room was at an all-time low. And I remember looking at Ernie and, hearing that he had cancer and just thinking, this guy needs a mate. And so I said, Ernie, if at any stage you need to get out of your room, just knock on my door and come for a yarn. And so that afternoon at 2:00, the tea and biscuit cart come around and I got my tea and bickies. It went to his room and then he knocked on my door with his tea and biscuits and come in for a chat. And I just remember the first day we spoke very surface level about, life and what he did for work and what I did for work. And we got to know each other. And then every day from there on for the next 2 weeks, he'd knock on my door at the same time every arvo and come in for an hour. And over the course of that 2 weeks, I got to know Ernie, on quite a deep level. And I started to understand that Ernie had terminal cancer, that he wasn't going to leave the hospital unless a miracle unfolded, that he had children, grandchildren. I believe he'd been married 3 times and divorced 3 times, but was still really good mates with all of his ex-wives. Like, he was just a character. But the thing that I really picked up was I was 23 at the time and so focused on how much money I made and thinking that money would, wash the slate clean of any insecurities I had, that it would make me feel better about who I was. It would solve all of my problems and that there would be no challenges in a world in which I had all the money that was on offer. And I remember sitting there and thinking, this guy's on his way out. He's facing imminent mortality. He's not once spoken about the car he drives, the size of the house that he owned, how much money he made at work, what type of suits he wore, but rather he's spoken about the people he loves, the memories he made with those people and the experiences that set his soul on fire. And just thinking, I'm 23 and unlike Ernie, I will make it out of this hospital bed. Something in my life has to change. And so I always say that Ernie gave me this incredible gift and this understanding that today is something to be incredibly grateful for. Tomorrow is an absolute privilege. And if you've got an attitude of gratitude and the appreciation to look at life in that way, it makes it all the more worthwhile. And so I left that hospital bed and made a real change in my life and decided at the time that, sometimes I think back and I think it was pretty extreme what my next action was. Like I quit my job a couple of weeks later and decided to just go and build this podcast and build the speaking stuff and throw myself in the deep end. And it was extreme, but sometimes when you're at rock bottom and something needs to change or you're going to continue to head in a really bad way, you need to do something extreme to change that. And so for me, it was like, I'm going to take real accountability of where I'm at, get myself back on track. And so that was a real catalyst for me to change. It was the catalyst that got me back invested in my health. It gave me time to do that. It gave me time to actually sit down and go, man, I'm 23 and I don't even know what I love anymore. Like, I don't have any passions or hobbies outside of work. I don't do anything for me. And so I basically started to ask myself some pretty honest questions about who I was and what I wanted from my life. And then I started to go on the path of, well, let's try these things and figure it out and see what sticks and what lands. And, for me, that year was a very forming year. And I can't even remember how we got onto this point, but essentially 2020 and the end of 2019 was life-changing for me. And it's, in particular, a period of a year that I look back on, I'm really proud of, because I'm so lucky that I met Ernie, and Ernie gave me this ability to cut through and to get self-aware enough that something was wrong and something needed to change.
Mm. And that's incredible. Even I can relate to that. In your 20s, I feel that it's probably very different to, say, the generation before us and before us again. That, I often hear people say, 20s are the best years of your life and you should be doing whatever you want with no worries. But I feel in the world that we're living in today, there is so much pressure on people in the 20-year period that you should know what you want to do. You should be earning as much money as you can. You should be owning a house. You should be buying this fancy car. And it's so overwhelming that you get wrapped up in it. And you lose who you are. You lose what your purpose and your passion is for life. And it's not until you have those realization moments that you're like, what am I actually doing? And who am I doing this for? And most of the time you sit back and reflect and go, I'm doing everything for everyone else, and I'm not even honoring what I value as a person and what I want to do. So I completely relate with that. And I feel that so many young people can probably relate with that as well. I know it's easier said than done to, all right, just quit your job and just go and pursue whatever you want to do. And I know you did mention that is an extreme. And unfortunately, a lot of us can't make those extremes. But what are those simple things that people can do to really start honoring themselves and asking those real pivotal questions so that they can start living their life the way that they want to live it?
Such a great question, Ash, and something I think about every day. And, little disclaimer there. It is definitely extreme what I did, and the measures that I took were quite extreme. And whilst I don't regret them, there are consequences that come with those extreme measures. Like, I got to a point where I was broke and had to sell my apartment. And I was lucky that my apartment made me some money, but that money runs out eventually. And I'm at a point now where I'm having to pivot and get flexible with my approach and find some more sustainable work so that, I don't have to stress about the gigs that are coming through for me to get on stage and the podcast producing me money. And so you have to get flexible, and there's definitely consequences that come with extreme measures. But I think as I've gone through the last 3.5 years now of being on this journey of really developing myself as a person, understanding that it's going to take time, that the answers don't come overnight. There's a incredible human being that I had on my podcast about a year or two ago. His name's Rich Davini, former Navy SEAL. And Rich said something to me that I think about consistently. He said, Brad, the quality of our lives is directly proportionate to the quality of questions we ask ourselves. And I just thought that was bang on. And so I started asking myself really quality questions. And for me, it was just, who am I? Like, what do I want from my life? And then the journey of how do I get there, or that quest is the fun part. But when it comes to the questions, you have to allow yourself to be honest with the answers, because how often do those questions that come up, like who am I or what do I want, get answered by who you think you should be or what you think you should want? You just touched on it there, and I'd be interested to hear from your experience where that expectation comes from, whether it's from, parents or friends or from social media. But I know for me, my parents always gave me the liberty to be who I wanted to be and desire the things in my life in which I desired. But I thought that I had to buy a house in my 20s. And so I did. And then I thought, well, I have to have a career at this point, and I have to move my way up the money scale every year and like earn more money and get promotions and build my way up in a company. You don't just get to do what you like, but you actually do.
Yes.
And when you allow yourself that freedom to get honest, and yeah, there has to be some healthy aspect of being realistic, not so much that you're cynical and you don't allow yourself to pursue any dreams at all, because I'm a massive dreamer. But for me, it's like that fine balance between being enough of a dreamer that you get to chase a life that feels purpose-driven and passion-fueled, but also being realistic enough that you allow it to become sustainable. And for everyone, that doesn't have to be, like, I'd say that the purpose and the passion that you get from life doesn't have to be your job. It can be outside of your job. It could be, the social sport that you play at 5 o'clock every night after you finish work. It could be what you do with your friends on the weekend. It could be your work. It looks different for everyone, but I think the first step in finding that peace, that state of peace for yourself, is allowing yourself to be honest with those answers. And so for me, it was like simple things. Invest a bit of time in my health every day. Like for me, that looks like a lot of running now and a bit of gym. But for someone else, that might look like social game of tennis. It might look like taking a 30-minute walk in the morning and listening to a podcast. But have some time every day. Like set aside an hour every day where you invest in you. You invest in the things you're passionate about. You invest back into your body and your health. You invest into your mind. And it's so simple. And I would encourage everyone where you have the opportunity to do it of a morning, because often life just gets in the way. And so it might mean that you wake up an hour earlier and go to bed an hour earlier. But if you can do something early in the morning that reminds you of who you are and what you want from your life, it means that the rest of the day gets pretty intentional.
I couldn't agree more.
I just think, like I wrote yesterday, I went out for a run in the morning by myself and it was pretty dark and like first light, and I can't run with headphones. I don't know why. My mind and my heart just don't like it. Like I feel like my heart is going to beat out of my chest if I've got music on or something in my
It's
headphones.
too much going on.
100%. So I either run with my partner or my mates or just by myself, and just when I'm by myself, I often just let my brain turn off for a minute. And as I finished the run, I felt really good. Like I didn't have a great sleep, but I felt really good after the run. And I remember sitting there and just thinking, like, if I had to create a few rules for myself every day to like get the most out of life, what would that be? And it was like, get up and move my body in the morning, watch the sun go up in the sky, drink good coffee, connect with good people, spend time with the people that I love, do something that makes me feel like I'm connected to a purpose, and do it all over again. And so for me, I've just created a few rules that I know fill my cup. And that's going to be individual for everyone. But I just encourage you to like get a journal, grab yourself a pen and just write down those things that make you feel good and make you feel connected every day, and try to live as closely to that as possible. And if that changes and you feel differently about them after a couple of months or a year, flip the script, change things up.
You know what's crazy is that I feel in the world we're living in today is that people are looking for that answer to solve all of their problems, to make them have sustainable happiness for the rest of their lives, when it really is just going back to basics and going back to the simple things that make you feel good. It's not, taking a pill and everything being fixed, or it's not going on an extravagant holiday or buying this car. Like all these things are short term, but it's sold to us like it's the answer. It's the answer to heal your soul and to make you reach this ultimate happiness. But as you mentioned, it's those small things in your everyday that really make the difference, yet we're sold that that is not enough. And I just find that so sad, because it would save people so much money. And I feel it would save also people so much stress around, I need to be happy or I need to be chasing something, this idea of success. But yet, whatever we do, we're always going to be told that it's not enough, because there's always something more that we have to chase. And that's where I feel that it's really unfortunate that not even young people that are growing up in this world, but even older generations that are now projecting this onto younger people, that, life is actually not that complicated. We just make it more complicated by listening to all the noise.
It's so true. And I'm so glad you went there, because I'm 27 now. And what I've really discovered in the last couple years is that, and I'm guilty of doing this too, because I think it's just a term of, like, it's just a phrase or it's something that we say, that to pursue happiness. And I think that we should all have a healthy dose of happiness in our life. But I think rather than pursuing happiness, we should pursue what's meaningful to us. Because I heard this really interesting concept recently around physical health, and it was called the rule of thirds. And this coach was speaking about how for his athletes, he explains to them that the rule of thirds applies to any athletic endeavor. The rule of thirds is that 1/3 of your training, you feel really good and you feel on top of the world. 1/3 of it feels pretty mediocre and pretty monotonous. And the other third is a real struggle and a real challenge. And that's a normal experience. And I think it's very much the same in life. And I think you could apply that to life, that for happiness to have meaning, you have to experience sadness or difficulty. For good to have meaning, you have to experience bad or a challenge. And so to pursue happiness and think that every area of your life is going to set a smile on your face and it's going to remain there the whole time is unrealistic. And then when you have that idea, you've have that expectation for what things are supposed to make you feel, and that feeling every time is supposed to be happiness, then when you don't feel that, when you don't experience that, you feel as though you've done something wrong. But the truth of life is so much of it is difficult. So much of it is hard. And it's getting through that difficulty, getting through that challenge, and then feeling the happiness, feeling the meaning that actually makes it worthwhile. And so I think for me, pursuing meaning has become the new focus, pursuing the adventure, understanding that the bad comes with the good comes with the bad, the challenge comes with the rise and the conquer. And that's just a part of life. And that means that sometimes you got to do things you don't want to do. Like, I love hosting my podcast, Ash, but I hate editing. But I'm like,
Yeah.
but for me right now to produce the podcast, I've got to sit in front of the edit. Like, I would just sit and have conversations for 10 hours a day if I had my way. But it's, it's part of the process. And so I think you're right. It's getting back to the simpler things and understanding that not every day is going to be the best day of your life, but every day is just another step in the right direction, and it comes with good and bad, and you have to be open to that.
And that's probably the curse, I feel, of social media, is that we see the success and we see the outcome. We don't see the journey. So we have all these people that are exposed to the result without seeing all the hard work that's gone into it, and all the struggle and all the tears. And that's where we're probably building a society that's so focused on the end result and achieving success overnight, that nobody's then willing to do the work or willing to keep pushing through when it gets hard. Instead, we run away because it's like, well, Joe Blow over there just got 100K followers overnight, but I didn't see all the hard work he put in, all the late nights that he put in. I just saw the success and I just want that. And so it's this whole back and forth of people just, whenever shit gets hard, it's you throw your hands in the air and go, oh, well, I don't know what to do now. I need to find something else. And then we get in this depressed and this negative mindset that our entire lives are bad, when really they're not. And if we just strip it back, and as I said, we just find ways to block out the noise, we can really start defining success for ourselves and not based on someone else. Because I find that's another thing as well, is that people are defining their own value of what success is based on other people. So as we talked about, owning your home, like for me, that's not really a priority in my success definition. Yet for so long, it's been my story, because it's what everyone else, I believe, were pushing me, as in messages from society, this is what you should be doing. So it's defining, what success looks like for you and what you really want to pursue. And that is a struggle, but as you mentioned, like, you have to be willing to do the work as well.
100%. And the work is tough. The work is, it has to be done consistently. And it's not just a day of work, it's every day of work. And for me, that's something that I've learned to really enjoy. Like, I've learned to enjoy the process, and I've learned to reward myself consistently for the process, not just for the outcome. And I think that's where sometimes we go wrong. We wait and we put all the hype and the expectation on the outcome is going to make you feel like, yes, this was all worthwhile. And you get there and you feel good for a minute, and then you kind of feel empty. And then you're like, oh, this wasn't like, this was supposed to be bigger than this. But for me, it's like the beauty is in the everyday. Like, and I think that's, as human beings, we have to like understand that that's what life is about. That's what gives life meaning, is that every day you get an opportunity to go out into the world and do your bit. And hopefully that bit adds to you, and it adds to society, and it adds to the people around you. And that's where the meaning lies in, going out in the world and having a purpose, having some direction. And so I just encourage everyone to like, just to go out and do what's right for you. Like, to ask yourself those questions. And sometimes you got to be a little bit selfish to be selfless. Sometimes you got to fill your cup first and do what you know is right for you, and make some honest, tough decisions around the direction that you want your life to take. And understand that it can be seasonal. It is going to change. Like, change is inevitable. We're human beings living in a world that's changing all the time. And so it's okay to change things and pivot and move in new directions. But you first got to ask yourself the honest questions, allow yourself to give honest answers. And then once your cup's full, you've got a little bit more to give.
I love that. And I mean, looking you talked about meaning, and you now strive for meaning in your everyday and in your life. For so long, I feel that you've probably been living in survival mode and just having to cope with your cystic fibrosis. But in saying that, now where you're at today, do you find that you're now willing to be able, as you mentioned, to help other people on this journey and also be able to share that message whilst also dealing with something that is quite challenging at times?
Yeah, most definitely. I feel as though I'm in a really good place with it, where I understand the ups and downs of it are inevitable. I'm in a really good place in which my health is quite stable and consistent now. There was particularly a big breakthrough for people with CF, where at least 50% of our community were positively benefited by a drug called Trikafta that was PBS listed, which is really, for me, it's lifted my lung function by 10%, cleared my lungs of all the mucus that was there, and allowed me to live a more stable life in which my lung bleeds are pretty much not there anymore. But I guess, for me, it was just a long time of, it's hard to deal with uncertainty as a human being. We like certain outcomes, but
Mm,
life is most definitely uncertain and unpredictable. And owning the fact that, like, I can't control everything here, but I can control how I respond was a big change for me. And that meant just, along the way, like let's help some people. Let's share my story. And also it's been a little bit selfish too, because for me, in sharing my story and challenging myself to run the marathons and do what I've done for charity in that space has given me that undeniable proof that I'm capable of overcoming big challenges in my life, that I am resilient.
mm,
And so for me, it's been a selfish and selfless encounter over the course of the last couple of years in sharing my story and challenging myself for the greater cause. And so I guess one of the areas in my life that was the hardest to do that was in the relationship space. Because I
mm,
think most people with CF, and I hear this story commonly, struggle with the idea that if my health is uncertain and my future is uncertain, how can a partner bet on the certainty of me? And
mm,
I felt that for a long time, and I allowed that to control my life too much. Like, I thought that I'd never have, a partner and children, and I'd never have the family that I always wanted. I come from a beautiful family. I wanted to create a beautiful family of my own. And so I got to a point where I had to accept that, like, it was this realization that, you know, for someone with CF, a life expectancy is around 40 years of age in Australia. Now, I don't believe that will be my reality. I've got plans to make it to 100. I'm going to be a centurion. And I
love it.
believe I can honestly live for a very long time. I'm in a great place with my health right now. But I remember thinking that, hold on, what gives anyone the certainty that they're going to live to 80? There's no such thing. No one's handed a ticket at the start of their life that says, here's your ticket for the next 80 years. When it gets to the end of that date, you got to check out. Sorry. No, it's just life is unpredictable. So I was like, it's the same for everyone. There is no certainty in this very uncertain and I guess unplanned world, that you have to live with what you've got, and you just have to live every day to the fullest. So I thought, no, I need to allow myself to be loved and to love someone else. And that's something I want in my life. And so for me, that was the hardest thing to overcome. But then
Mm,
what I did, when I overcome it, when I allowed myself to get vulnerable and to get honest and really put myself out there. And I heard this incredible quote this morning that I'll butcher this, but like, the heart has to be broken before it's properly healed. Like,
mm,
you have to put yourself in a place where your heart can be broken so that you can fully accept and give love.
mm,
And for me, I put myself out there, and I'm so lucky that I found the most amazing partner that I want to spend the rest of my life with. And so I think just for me, the message has been that, like, to be able to do good in the world, to be able to create meaningful things in the world and in your life, you have to be vulnerable and you have to put yourself out there, and you have to be in a place in which you're willing to hurt a little bit to gain a lot,
mm,
and that is the pain that comes with the pure joy and the pure happiness and the pure meaning. And so the hardest thing for me was definitely opening up to that area of my life. I think as a natural storyteller, a natural conversationalist, for me, sharing my story came relatively easy. It came with, like, this is exciting for me and this is an enjoyable and meaningful pursuit for me. But there were
mm,
other areas in my life that took a whole lot more time, concentration, and come with a whole lot more difficulty. But I feel like my life's in a very good place now, and I feel privileged to say that, because I know
Mm.
that not everyone can say that for themselves, but I definitely felt as though at times in my life that wasn't a potential. And so
Mm.
I guess there's that message for everyone that you have to stick in there and keep showing up for yourself, because one day there'll be very big realization that it was all worthwhile.
Mm. Oh, I couldn't say it better myself. And I mean, I was going to ask, what's the last advice that you'd give to someone? But I feel that you just summed it up perfectly. But there is one question that I will stick to and want to ask, because I feel like I could talk to you forever about your story. And you have so much insight and positivity just to share, not only about your own story, but about how people can just implement simple things into their everyday. So thank you for all the insight. But lastly, I know it's hard to narrow it down just to one thing, but looking back on your entire journey to where you are today, what is the one thing that you believe has stuck with you the whole time and that could positively help someone else out there that is just struggling at the moment for what we mentioned about of just getting through the hard yards? And it might not even be an illness as such. It's just the hardness of life, as we know, that it's just small things every day that can get people stuck in a little bit of a rut. So what is that one thing that you think that could really just help someone and positively impact their life based on what you've learned?
Yeah, I come back to that first lesson my parents ever taught me, which is what you believe is what you become. I had someone ask me a question on Instagram yesterday. They said, "What's the greatest advice you've ever been given?" And I think I was given this subliminal advice, but also this verbal advice from my parents that, in all areas of my life, they always used to say to me, back yourself, like back yourself. If I was playing footy on the weekend, my dad would say, if they pass you the ball, back yourself, run it
Mm.
as hard as you can, try to score a try. It was at school, back yourself, have a go. Like, believe that you have what you need to go and be capable of good things. Believe that it is within you that you can go out in the world and do something extraordinary. And I think that there's this self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to belief, that what you believe dictates your behavior, and then behavior often dictates outcomes.
Mm.
And so for me, that outcome then, hopefully being positive, if you've had positive belief and positive behaviors, reinforces that positive belief. But if you flip the script and go, well, I believe negative things about myself, and I believe that I'm not enough and I'm not good enough and I don't have what it takes to achieve my goals and succeed in life, well, then my behavior is going to be negative. I'm going to show up in the world that way. And then the outcomes aren't going to be favorable. And now all of a sudden I'm reaffirming that original belief. So for me, it starts with what you believe about yourself.
Mm.
And you have to believe, and you deserve to believe, that you're capable of doing good things and that you're capable of leading a life that's meaningful to you.
Mm.
And every day I wake up and I have the most self-belief in the world. I believe I can be one of the best podcasters in the country, in the world. I believe that I'm capable of being the best speaker every time I stand on stage, and I'm capable of moving the room and showing up with purpose and living a life through that purpose. And then my behavior follows, and my outcomes have been very fruitful. And it takes time, and it doesn't always work out the way you want it to. But in a world full of uncontrollables, if you can control what you believe about yourself, how you show up in the world, and the perspective you have when things don't go to plan, if you can see the good in it, if you can be grateful for the challenges that you have, as I have with my CF, and understand that it molds you and it makes you stronger and more resilient, then you'll be in good stead. Life eventually will provide good opportunities and good outcomes for you, and you deserve to live that way, and you most certainly should live that way, because life is hard enough as it is. So why be so hard on yourself?
Absolutely amazing. I mean, if that wasn't the best pet talk I've heard, I don't know what is for other people. Thank you so, so much for jumping on today and sharing your story, and also things that you've learned along the way. I know I've taken lots of little things out of it that I'm definitely going to start doing in my own life, because I think that sometimes, yeah, we all just need those little realization points and those positive pep talks to remind ourselves of what we should actually be doing in our own lives and what questions we should be asking. So thank you so much, and congratulations on your journey and where you're at today. I think it's phenomenal, not only what you're doing for the community, but what you've done for yourself and how you continue to turn up for yourself. So thank you.
No, thank you. I think you should be very proud of what you're building here with this platform and everything you're doing in your life. And it takes somebody providing opportunities to allow other people to come share, speak, and deliver their messages. And that just multiplies the purpose of many people doing many good and meaningful things. And so you should be very proud of what you've built. And it's an absolute pleasure to come and share on the Secret Sunday service.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone else out there for joining us for another session. We'll catch you all in a couple of weeks, but yeah, go and be positive and go start asking yourself those questions.